It started with a signature, a decision made behind closed doors, a move that would send shockwaves through the global economy. And March 4th, 2025, was officially the first day of Trump's new trade war. No one knew just how bad it would be. Markets expected turbulence, but not a bloodbath. Investors hoped for uncertainty, but not catastrophe. And yet, as the markets opened, it became clear. This wasn't just another political stunt. This was economic warfare. The moment the bell rang on Wall Street, trillions of dollars began to vanish. Panic set in, a sell-off unlike anything seen since the last financial crisis. And across the border, America's closest allies struck back hard. Day one of Trump's trade war had begun. And has the regret already kicked in? Let's find out. Before the markets even had a chance to adjust, the damage was already done. Within minutes of opening, Wall Street was in freefall. The S&P 500 nosedived 2% in an instant. In a single morning, $3.4 trillion in market value vanished. Investors who had once celebrated Trump's post-election rally now watched in horror as their portfolios shrank in real time. The sell-off wasn't just fast, it was brutal. The Dow Jones Industrial Average suffered one of its worst days in years, plunging 800 points as institutional investors dumped stocks at a frantic pace. Meanwhile, the Nasdaq Composite, once the backbone of America's tech dominance, officially entered correction territory, down 10% from its December peak. This wasn't a temporary dip. This was full-blown panic. But it wasn't just stocks. The market's fear gauge, the CBOE Volatility Index (VIX), spiked to its highest level since December 2024. The message was clear. Investors weren't just reacting, they were fleeing. The optimism that had fueled one of the longest bull markets in history had collapsed overnight. Yet the bloodbath wasn't random. It wasn't just high-risk companies facing a sell-off. It was the titans of American industry, companies that had been seen as unstoppable. NVIDIA, the golden child of artificial intelligence, saw a sharp decline as uncertainty loomed over US-China relations. Alphabet, Google's parent company, struggled to stabilize. Amazon, a behemoth in global commerce, suddenly found itself vulnerable. It is a company that once symbolized innovation, now in freefall. Tesla, already struggling with supply chain disruptions, suffered one of the most dramatic losses of the day, crashing 45% from its late 2024 high. Investors who had once bet on Musk's vision were now desperately pulling their money out, fearing that the worst was yet to come. Wall Street had placed its bets. They believed Trump wouldn't touch the economy that had made him a second-term president. But by the time the markets closed, those bets were lost. And for investors, businesses, and ordinary Americans, the real pain was only beginning. Here's a reminder to please like and share the video and subscribe to our channel to watch more videos on Africa's geopolitics, economy, and changing landscape. Let's continue now. Remember, this was not a surprise. For months, the warnings had been there. Economists, business leaders, and even members of Trump's administration had cautioned against it. But in the end, none of it mattered. On March 4th, 2025, President Donald Trump made his move, launching one of the most aggressive tariff policies in modern history. The numbers were staggering. A 25% tariff on all Mexican imports, another 25% on all Canadian goods, a fresh 10% levy slapped onto Canadian energy exports, sending a clear message to America's northern neighbor. No industry was safe. And then came China. The existing 10% tariff was doubled to 20%, escalating a battle that had already strained relations between the world's two largest economies. But behind these numbers was something even more alarming. It wasn't just governments that would pay the price. It was businesses, consumers, and supply chains that had spent decades intertwined. These tariffs meant American manufacturers would now pay more for raw materials. Small businesses that relied on affordable imports would be squeezed overnight. And the average American household? They were about to feel the impact in their wallets. Trump, as always, had his reasons. Drugs are still pouring into our country from Mexico and Canada at very high and unacceptable levels, he declared, framing the tariffs as a national security measure. But was this really about security? Or was this an economic war disguised as patriotism? One thing was certain. America's trading partners weren't going to take this lying down. And the first to strike back? Canada. If Trump thought Canada would hesitate, he was wrong. Within hours of the tariffs being announced, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau stood before the nation, not with a plea for negotiations, but with a counterstrike, a direct, calculated, and punishing economic retaliation. A 25% tariff on $100 billion worth of U.S. goods. A swift $30 billion in immediate tariffs, with another $125 billion waiting to be deployed in 21 days. But this wasn't just about numbers. Canada had chosen its targets carefully, striking where it would hurt the U.S. economy the most. First, energy. A 25% export tax on electricity flowing to 1.5 million American homes in Minnesota, Michigan, and New York. And that was just the warning shot. If Trump escalated further, Canada threatened to cut off electricity exports entirely, turning the lights out for parts of America. Then came the nickel embargo. Canada, one of the world's largest producers, announced it would stockpile its nickel rather than sell it to the U.S., instantly disrupting America's supply of a critical metal used in military equipment and batteries. Trudeau didn't mince words. Trump has repeatedly hinted that Canada should become the 51st state. That is never going to happen. The implication was clear. This was no longer just about trade. It was about sovereignty. But Trudeau wasn't alone. From Ontario to Nova Scotia, Canadian leaders vowed to escalate if necessary. As tensions mounted, another country prepared to strike back: Mexico. Canada had already delivered its retaliation, but the real storm was still brewing. To the south, Mexico was preparing its economic counterattack. Across the Pacific, China, America's largest trading rival, was watching, waiting, and ready to make its move. Mexican officials wasted no time. While the full extent of their retaliation hadn't been revealed yet, sources within Mexico's economic ministry hinted at a devastating blow aimed directly at the heart of American industries. One of the first casualties? American agriculture. Mexico, the largest buyer of U.S. corn, soybeans, and pork, was expected to impose crippling tariffs on these essential exports, putting Midwestern farmers in immediate jeopardy. The auto industry, already rattled by Canada's response, now faced another nightmare. Mexico's manufacturing plants are deeply embedded in the supply chains of Ford, GM, and Tesla. If Mexico raised tariffs on U.S.-made parts or restricted supply chains, American automakers would be left scrambling for alternatives. And then there was China, the economic giant that had already endured years of trade tensions with the U.S. But this time, Beijing wasn't playing defense. With Trump doubling tariffs to 20%, China was prepared to retaliate where it would hurt the most: technology and manufacturing. Chinese officials hinted at expanding tariffs on U.S. semiconductors, effectively cutting off a major market for companies like Intel and AMD. But the real threat? A crackdown on rare earth exports. China controls over 80% of the world's rare earth minerals, essential for everything from iPhones to fighter jets. If Beijing restricted access, American tech and military industries would face an unprecedented crisis. The message from both Mexico and China was clear. This wasn't just about trade anymore. It was an economic battlefield, and the United States was now outnumbered. The markets had already collapsed, trade alliances were breaking, and now a new question emerged. How far was Trump willing to go? Markets can recover, tariffs can be lifted, but some wounds take longer to heal. The first day of Trump's trade war had already erased trillions in market value, strained relationships with America's closest allies, and put industries on high alert. But this wasn't just a one-day panic. The effects of these tariffs were setting off a chain reaction, one that could reshape the global economy for years to come. American companies weren't just watching this unfold. They were already making their moves. Major corporations had begun warning shareholders of lower profits, supply chain disruptions, and price hikes. General Motors and Ford braced for billions in losses as tariffs made imported auto parts more expensive. Home builders, reliant on Canadian lumber, prepared for a surge in material costs that would make housing even less affordable for Americans. Even small businesses, from restaurants to electronics retailers, were caught in the crossfire, facing rising prices on everything from food imports to computer components. And then there was the geopolitical fallout. The United States was no longer just fighting a trade war. It was isolating itself on the global stage. Canada had already pivoted toward stronger economic ties with Europe and Asia. Mexico was looking to South American partners to replace American imports. And China? It was doubling down on its Belt and Road Initiative, strengthening economic ties with African and Middle Eastern nations, and solidifying itself as an alternative to U.S. economic dominance. Despite the chaos, there were whispers from within the White House. Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick suggested that a relief pathway for Canada and Mexico might be on the table. Could this be an attempt to de-escalate? Or was it just another empty promise to calm investors? One thing was certain: Trump had unleashed an economic storm. But this wasn't just about market volatility anymore. The U.S., once the epicenter of global trade, was now isolating itself at an unprecedented pace. Allies are no longer just considering alternatives. They are acting. De-dollarization, once a distant theory, has now become a survival strategy. Nations are accelerating their shift away from the U.S. dollar, forging new trade alliances, and cutting economic ties. What was once a cautious rebalancing has turned into a necessity. The question is no longer if the world would move on from the U.S., but how fast it would happen. But will Trump step back? Will he stop the chaos he started before it's too late? Let us know in the comment section. What might happen to the U.S. if this trade war continues? Do you want to watch more videos like this one? If yes, subscribe to our channel and press the bell icon next to it. We have decided to bring videos on something nobody talks about: African politics, economy, and increasing power. Thanks for watching, and until the next video, stay tuned.
Tell us what you think in the comment section. Like and share the video, and subscribe so that you don't miss any of our African videos. It's the best way to support us.